The moment Alexander Kane handed his unlimited black credit card to the woman standing in line at the food bank, he expected to witness the predictable collapse of human dignity in the face of unlimited temptation. What he got instead was a lesson in humanity that would shatter everything he believed about money, poverty, and the true nature of wealth. 48 hours, Alexander said quietly, pressing the card into Maria Santos's calloused hand as she waited with her 6-year-old daughter for their weekly allocation of canned goods and day-old bread. Use it however you want. Buy whatever you want. No limits. No questions. Maria stared at the platinum card as if it might explode in her palm. Around them, the community center buzzed with the quiet desperation of families stretching government assistance and charitable donations to cover basic survival. I don't understand, Maria whispered, instinctively pulling her daughter closer. Who are you? What do you want? Alexander studied her face. The premature lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the careful way she held herself that suggested someone accustomed to making every movement count, the protective stance that marked her as a mother who had learned the world was not safe for her child. She was exactly what he had been looking for. Someone desperate enough to reveal their true nature when given unlimited resources. My name is Alexander Kane. I'm conducting a social experiment about human behavior and financial opportunity. His voice carried the clinical detachment of someone who viewed people as data points rather than individuals. In 48 hours, I'll review every transaction made with that card. What you choose to do with unlimited wealth will tell me everything I need to know about who you really are. Maria's grip tightened on her daughter's hand. And then what? Then the experiment ends. The card is deactivated, and life returns to normal. What Alexander didn't tell her was that this was the 5th time he had conducted this experiment. The previous 4 subjects had confirmed his cynical worldview perfectly, spending sprees on designer clothing, luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and indulgent experiences that proved poor people were just rich people waiting for an opportunity to reveal their greed. He expected Maria Santos to follow the same pattern, to abandon dignity in favor of materialism, to prove that poverty was a moral failing rather than a circumstance. He had built a fortune worth $8.2 billion on the assumption that most people were fundamentally selfish, short-sighted, and motivated primarily by personal gain. His business empire, a network of tech companies, real estate holdings, and financial services, operated on the principle that human beings would always choose immediate gratification over long-term benefit. This experiment was designed to confirm what Alexander Kane already believed, that given unlimited resources, poor people would make the same wasteful, self-serving decisions as everyone else. Maria looked at the card again, then at her daughter Emma, who was clutching a worn stuffed rabbit and trying to understand why a strange man was giving her mother something that seemed to frighten her. Why me? Maria asked. Because you're here, Alexander replied with brutal honesty. Because you're poor. Because I want to see what someone in your situation does when money is no longer a barrier to anything you desire. The cruelty of his words was casual, delivered without malice, but also without compassion. To Alexander, Maria was not a human being struggling to survive. She was a laboratory rat in a maze designed to confirm his pre-existing theories about human nature. Maria was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing the raised numbers on a credit card that represented more wealth than she had ever imagined possessing. What if I don't want to participate in your experiment? Then you hand back the card and continue waiting in line for free groceries. Around them, other families shuffled. Forward in the food bank queue, elderly people counting coupons, young mothers calculating whether they could afford both milk and bread, children too young to understand why their parents looked so tired all the time. Maria looked at her daughter, then at the card, then at Alexander Kane with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. 48 hours, she repeated. 48 hours. Maria slipped the card into her worn purse. Her decision made for reasons Alexander would not understand for another 2 days. Thank you, she said quietly, though Alexander sensed she was not thanking him for the card. As Maria and Emma left the community center, Alexander felt the familiar satisfaction of an experiment properly initiated. By tomorrow evening, he would have transaction records proving once again that poor people were just rich people who hadn't been given the opportunity to reveal their essential selfishness. He had no idea that Maria Santos was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. A lesson about what real wealth looked like when it was measured not in dollars spent, but in lives saved. A lesson that would leave him in tears and change everything he thought he knew about money, dignity, and the true cost of being human. The 48-hour countdown had begun, and Alexander Kane had just handed unlimited financial power to a woman whose definition of wealth was completely different from his own. If you think this story is about a poor woman going on a shopping spree, you're wrong. If you think this ends with a simple lesson about generosity, you're wrong. What Maria Santos does with unlimited credit will challenge everything you believe about poverty, sacrifice, and the difference between having money and being truly rich. Stay close. Keep watching, because sometimes the most powerful people are the ones with nothing left to lose and everything to give. Wait, if you're new to this channel, press the subscribe and the like button and be part of Mr. Peter audiobook channel. I am planning on sharing out $5,000 randomly to any of my subscribers, and you could be lucky to be chosen. Let's continue with the story. Maria Santos had not always been the woman standing in food bank lines with holes in her shoes and desperation in her eyes. 3 years ago, she had been Dr. Maria Santos, a pediatric nurse at San Francisco General Hospital, earning a respectable salary and building a life she was proud of. She had owned a small apartment in the Mission District, drove a reliable Honda Civic, and was saving money for Emma's college fund while working nights to help premature babies fight for their first breaths. The transformation from middle-class professional to food bank recipient had taken exactly 18 months and been caused by 3 words no parent is ever prepared to hear. Your daughter has leukemia? Emma's diagnosis at age 4 had shattered Maria's world completely. The aggressive treatment protocol required constant medical supervision, weekly trips to UCSF Children's Hospital, and medications that cost more per month than Maria's rent. Even with health insurance, the copays, experimental treatments, and time off work to care for her daughter had created medical debt that consumed her savings, her credit, and eventually her home. Maria had sold everything she owned, her car, her furniture, her grandmother's jewelry, to pay for treatments that kept Emma alive but left them financially destroyed. When the hospital demanded upfront payment for a crucial bone marrow procedure, Maria had taken out predatory loans with interest rates that guaranteed she would never escape the debt. She had lost her nursing job when Emma's medical needs made it impossible to work consistent shifts. The apartment had been foreclosed when the medical bills consumed her entire income. They had been living in her car for 2 weeks before finding space in a transitional housing program that provided a single room with shared kitchen facilities. But Emma was alive. Emma was healthy. Emma was a bright, curious 6-year-old who drew pictures of rainbows and believed her mother could fix anything. That was all that mattered to Maria. Everything else was just logistics she would figure out one day at a time. The food bank had become a weekly necessity, not because Maria was lazy or irresponsible, but because every dollar she earned from her part-time job cleaning offices went to rent, utilities, Emma's ongoing medical monitoring, and the crushing debt payments that would follow them for years. Maria had swallowed her pride, accepted help from strangers, and learned to navigate systems designed for people society had given up on. Not because she had failed, but because she had chosen to save her daughter's life at any cost. Standing in that community center with Alexander Kane's credit card in her hand, Maria was not thinking about what she could buy for herself. She was thinking about the families around her who were fighting the same impossible battles she had been fighting for 3 years. Alexander Kane had been born into wealth, but he had not always been the cold, emotionally detached billionaire who viewed human suffering as data to be analyzed. As a child growing up in Pacific Heights, Alexander had been sensitive, empathetic, quick to cry when he saw homeless people on the street or animals in distress. His mother, Catherine Kane, had been a prominent philanthropist who taught him that wealth came with responsibility to help others. But Catherine had died when Alexander was 12, a sudden heart attack that left him alone with his father, Robert Kane, a venture capitalist whose approach to parenting was identical to his approach to business. Ruthlessly efficient, emotionally detached, and focused exclusively on measurable outcomes. Compassion is a luxury we cannot afford, Robert had told Alexander after finding him crying over a news story about children in foster care. Successful people make decisions based on logic, not feelings. The moment you let emotion dictate your choices is the moment you become vulnerable to people who will exploit your weakness. Robert Kane had spent 6 years systematically training the empathy out of his son through a combination of boarding school isolation, psychological manipulation, and financial lessons designed to prove that poor people were poor because they made bad decisions, not because they faced impossible circumstances. If you give money to beggars, you enable their failure, Robert would say during their weekly dinners at exclusive restaurants. If you donate to charities, you create dependency rather than self-sufficiency. Real wealth comes from understanding that most people will disappoint you if you give them the opportunity. By the time Alexander graduated from Stanford Business School, he had internalized his father's worldview completely. He believed that success was a moral virtue, that poverty was a character flaw, and that generous people were naive fools who would eventually be destroyed by their own kindness. Alexander had built his empire by acquiring struggling companies, eliminating inefficiencies, which usually meant firing employees who had families to support, and maximizing profits through strategies that prioritized shareholders over human beings. His business philosophy was simple. People were resources to be managed, not individuals to be valued. His personal life reflected the same approach. Alexander had never married, maintained only superficial relationships, and lived in a penthouse apartment that showcased his wealth but contained nothing that revealed his personality or preferences. He had conducted 4 previous experiments with his unlimited credit card, each one confirming his belief that poor people would make predictably selfish choices when given access to wealth. The subjects had spent money on luxury items, expensive meals, designer clothing, immediate gratification that proved their lack of long-term thinking and financial discipline. Alexander expected Maria Santos to follow the same pattern because, in his experience, everyone eventually revealed their fundamental selfishness when the constraints were removed. He had no concept of what it meant to sacrifice everything for someone else's survival. He had no understanding of what it felt like to choose love over comfort, dignity over ease, or hope over despair. And he had no idea that Maria Santos was about to show him the difference between being rich and being wealthy. While Alexander returned to his penthouse office in downtown San Francisco, Maria walked home to the transitional housing facility with Emma skipping beside her, both of them carrying plastic bags of groceries from the food bank. "Mama," Emma said as they climbed the stairs to their room. "Who was that man? Why'd he give you something?" Maria paused at their door, considering how to explain Alexander Kane's experiment to a 6-year-old who still believed the world was fundamentally fair and kind. "He's someone who wants to learn about people," Maria said carefully. "He gave me something that might help us, but I need to think very carefully about how to use it." Their room was small, barely 300 square feet with 2 twin beds, a mini refrigerator, and a hot plate for cooking. But Maria had made it feel like home with Emma's artwork taped to the walls, books borrowed from the public library stacked on every surface, and a jar of wildflowers Emma had picked from the courtyard. Emma immediately settled at the tiny table with her coloring books while Maria unpacked their groceries: canned soup, peanut butter, day-old bread, and the fresh apples that were Emma's favorite treat. As she organized their supplies, Maria thought about the credit card hidden in her purse and the 48 hours that stretched ahead of them like an impossible opportunity. She could pay off the medical debt that followed them everywhere. She could put down a deposit on a real apartment where Emma could have her own room. She could buy Emma new clothes that fit properly, shoes that didn't have holes, toys that weren't donated cast-offs for more fortunate children. She could splurge on experiences they had never been able to afford: a trip to the zoo, dinner in a nice restaurant, maybe even a weekend vacation to the beach where Emma could build sandcastles and forget about hospital visits and financial stress. But as Maria watched her daughter color a picture of a rainbow with careful concentration, she thought about something else entirely. She thought about Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down and rationed her heart medication because she couldn't afford the full prescription. She thought about David, the single father across the hall who worked 3 jobs but still couldn't afford decent childcare for his toddler son. She thought about the family she saw every week at the food bank. People who were fighting the same impossible battle she was fighting, people who needed help but had no Alexander Kane appearing in their lives with miraculous opportunities. Emma looked up from her coloring book with the pure, trusting smile that had carried Maria through 3 years of darkness. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" Yes, baby, Maria replied, making a decision that Alexander Kane would never understand. We're going to be okay. And so is everyone else we can help. Maria pulled the credit card from her purse and stared at it one more time. Alexander Kane expected her to reveal her selfishness. Instead, she was about to show him what real wealth looked like when it was shared rather than hoarded. The 48-hour countdown had begun, and Maria Santos was about to transform an experiment in human greed into a masterclass in human dignity. The first transaction Alexander Kane expected to see on his credit card statement was a shopping spree at Nordstrom or perhaps an expensive dinner at a five-star restaurant. Instead, at 6:23 a.m. on the first morning of the experiment, Maria Santos walked into San Francisco General Hospital's billing department and quietly paid off $127,000 in medical debt. Not her own, but that of every family currently receiving treatment in the pediatric cancer ward. She had spent the night researching which families were facing financial ruin because of their children's medical needs, cross-referencing public records with social media posts and GoFundMe campaigns that painted pictures of parents choosing between rent money and life-saving treatments. The billing supervisor, Janet Morrison, had worked in hospital administration for 23 years and had never seen anything like what Maria was requesting. "Ma'am, I need to understand what you're asking for," Janet said, staring at the list of account numbers Maria had compiled. "You want to pay medical bills for 17 different families? People you don't know?" "People I do know," Maria corrected quietly. "I know what it feels like to watch your child fight for their life, while insurance companies fight your claims. I know what it feels like to choose between medications and groceries. I know what it feels like to sleep in hospital waiting rooms because you can't afford a hotel." Maria had spent 3 hours in the hospital's family lounge the night before, talking to parents who were living through the same nightmare she had survived. She had listened to stories of families losing their homes, their cars, their hope while their children underwent treatments that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. "The Hendersons in room 314, Maria continued, consulting her handwritten notes. "Their son Tyler has been fighting leukemia for 8 months. Mr. Henderson lost his job because he missed too many days caring for Tyler. They're behind on their mortgage and facing foreclosure next month." Janet nodded slowly. She knew the family, had worked with them on payment plans that never seemed adequate for the crushing weight of their debt. "The Patels in room 218. Their daughter Priya needs experimental treatment that isn't covered by insurance. They've borrowed against their retirement, maxed out credit cards, and started a GoFundMe campaign that has raised maybe 15% of what they need." Maria's voice was steady, but Janet could see tears building in her eyes. The Johnsons, the Lees, the Martinez family, all of them fighting the same impossible choice between their child's life and their family's financial survival. All of them drowning in debt that will follow them for decades, even if their children survive. Janet looked at the credit card Maria had placed on the counter, a black American Express card that indicated unlimited spending power. "Ma'am, this is a significant amount of money. Are you certain you want to?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." What Janet didn't know was that Maria had also compiled a second list. Families whose children had died despite their parents' desperate financial sacrifices. Families who were left with crushing debt and no child to justify the financial devastation. Maria paid their bills too. $127,000 eliminated in a single transaction, freeing 17 families from medical debt that would have destroyed their futures. As Maria walked out of the hospital, she felt her phone buzzing with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Dr. James Rivera, pediatric oncologist at UCSF Children's. I heard about what you did at SF General. Could we meet? There's something I think you should know." Dr. James Rivera was not what Maria expected when she met him at a small cafe near the hospital. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time caring for patients than worrying about his appearance. But there was an intensity in his expression that suggested this meeting was about more than expressing gratitude for her generosity. "Ms. Santos," Dr. Rivera said as they settled into a corner booth, "what you did this morning, paying off those families' medical bills, it's the most extraordinary act of generosity I've witnessed in 15 years of practicing medicine." "It was the right thing to do," Maria replied simply. "Those families are fighting for their children's lives. They shouldn't also have to fight for their financial survival." Dr. Rivera studied her face with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details others might miss. May I ask how you knew to target those specific families? The accounts you paid were all cases where families were facing immediate financial crisis that would have forced them to discontinue treatment. Maria felt a chill of recognition. She had been a nurse long enough to understand medical triage, the systematic prioritization of cases based on urgency and resource availability. You've been tracking which families are in the most desperate situations. It's part of my job, Dr. Rivera said carefully. As head of the pediatric oncology social work team, I maintain files on every family's financial status, insurance coverage, and ability to continue treatment. What you did this morning, you saved not just their financial futures, but potentially their children's lives. You pulled out a tablet and showed Maria a list that made her heart sink. These are families who have been forced to discontinue treatment due to financial constraints over the past year. Children who might have survived if their parents could have afforded to continue their care. Maria stared at the names, recognizing some of them from support groups she had attended during Emma's treatment. Why are you showing me this? Dr. Rivera leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Because there are more families facing the same crisis right now. And because what you did this morning suggests you have access to resources that could save lives. I don't understand what you're asking. I'm asking if you would be willing to do more. There are experimental treatments, specialized medications, medical procedures that could save children's lives but aren't covered by insurance. There are families who are literally watching their children die because they can't afford care that costs less than what some people spend on luxury cars. Maria felt the weight of Alexander Kane's credit card in her purse like a burning ember. She had 39 hours remaining in the experiment, and she was already thinking about how to use every minute. Dr. Rivera, if I said yes, if I said I wanted to help every family you could identify, how many children's lives could be saved? James Rivera looked at her with an expression that mixed hope with disbelief. With unlimited resources? Conservatively, we could save 12 children who are currently facing terminal diagnoses due to financial constraints. We could fund treatment for 37 families who are considering discontinuing care. We could provide experimental therapies for cases that have exhausted traditional options. Then let's save them all. Dr. Rivera stared at her as if she had just offered to move mountains. Ms. Santos, the kind of medical interventions we're discussing could cost millions of dollars. I need to understand. Who are you? How do you have access to these resources? Maria hesitated, realizing that Dr. Rivera's question touched on something she hadn't fully considered about Alexander Kane's experiment. I'm just someone who was given an opportunity to help people, she said finally. And I've decided that 48 hours is enough time to save as many children as possible. But as Maria spoke, she realized that Dr. Rivera was looking at her with more than professional appreciation. There was something in his eyes, admiration, attraction, connection, that made her suddenly aware that she was not just helping children, but potentially building relationships that could extend far beyond Alexander Kane's arbitrary timeline. Ms. Santos, Maria, what you're proposing to do, the lives you're choosing to save, I've never met anyone like you. Maria felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with medical emergencies or financial stress. For the first time in 3 years, she was looking at a man who saw her not as a charity case or a single mother struggling to survive, but as someone capable of extraordinary things. Dr. Rivera, James, please call me James. James, I need you to understand something. This opportunity I've been given, it's temporary. In 39 hours, everything goes back to normal. The resources disappear, and I return to being just another single mother trying to pay rent and keep my daughter healthy. James reached across the table and gently touched her hand. What if it doesn't have to be temporary? What if what you do in the next 39 hours creates something permanent? Before Maria could ask what he meant, her phone rang with a call from a number she recognized but had been dreading. Alexander Kane. I need to take this, she said apologetically. Ms. Santos. Alexander's voice was carefully controlled, but Maria could hear confusion beneath his professional tone. I've been reviewing the initial transactions on the credit card I provided. There seems to have been some kind of mistake. What kind of mistake? The first charge was for medical bill payments at San Francisco General Hospital. A significant amount paid to the billing department for accounts that don't appear to be in your name. Maria felt her pulse quicken as she realized Alexander had been monitoring her card usage in real time. There was no mistake, Mr. Kane. You paid over $127,000 in medical bills for other people. People you don't know. People I do know. People who are fighting battles I've fought before. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Maria wondered if the call had been disconnected. Miss Santos, Alexander said finally, his voice carrying something that might have been confusion or might have been something else entirely. That's not what I expected you to do with unlimited financial resources. What did you expect me to do? Another pause. I expected you to spend money on yourself, on your daughter, on things you've always wanted but never been able to afford. Maria looked across the table at James Rivera, who was listening to her side of the conversation with growing understanding of what she was dealing with. Mr. Kane, when you gave me this credit card, you said you wanted to learn something about human nature. What you're learning is that some people define wealth not by what they can buy for themselves, but by what they can do for others. That's not sustainable behavior, Miss Santos. It's financially irrational. Maybe, but it's who I am. Maria ended the call and looked at James, who was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. The man who gave you the credit card, he's testing you. He's testing his theory that poor people are fundamentally selfish and will reveal their greed when given access to unlimited money. And instead, you're proving that some people become more generous, not more selfish, when they have the power to help. Maria nodded, feeling the weight of Alexander Kane's scrutiny and James Rivera's admiration in equal measure. James, I have 38 hours left. If you can identify 12 children whose lives can be saved with the right medical intervention, I want to save all of them. And then what? When the 48 hours ends and the resources disappear? Maria looked at James Rivera, this man who had dedicated his life to saving children, who was looking at her as if she might be the answer to prayers he hadn't known he was making, and realized that Alexander Kane's experiment was teaching her something she hadn't expected to learn. She was capable of more than just surviving. She was capable of changing the world. Then we figure out how to keep saving children without a billionaire's credit card, she said. Together, James smiled, and Maria felt something shift inside her chest. Not just hope for the children they could save, but hope for a future that extended beyond the next 38 hours. Alexander Kane had given her unlimited financial power for 2 days. But James Rivera was offering her something more valuable, a partnership that could last long after the experiment ended. The only question was whether she was brave enough to believe she deserved both. If you are new to this channel, hit the subscribe and like button and be part of Mr. Peter audiobook family. By hour 16 of the experiment, Maria Santos and Dr. James Rivera had established what could only be described as an underground railroad for medical miracles. Working from a conference room at UCSF Children's Hospital that James had converted into their temporary command center, they had identified 43 families facing immediate medical crises that could be solved with financial intervention. The walls were covered with charts, medical files, and photographs of children whose lives hung in the balance between hope and bankruptcy. The Williamson family, James said, pointing to a file on their growing list. Their daughter Sarah has cystic fibrosis and needs a lung transplant. They're first on the waiting list, but they can't afford the $400,000 surgery and 6-month recovery period. Maria was already reaching for Alexander's credit card. Call the hospital's transplant coordinator. Tell them Sarah Williamson's surgery is fully funded as of right now. James made the call while Maria processed another transaction, $400,000 that would save a 12-year-old girl's life. As he spoke with medical administrators, Maria watched his face light up with the joy of someone who had spent years watching children die for financial reasons and was finally able to offer hope instead of apologies. When he hung up, James looked at Maria with an expression that made her pulse quicken. Sarah's surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. You just saved her life. We just saved her life, Maria corrected. The correction was small, but it carried weight that had nothing to do with medical procedures and everything to do with the partnership that was developing between them. They had fallen into a rhythm of identifying cases, researching solutions, and implementing interventions with the efficiency of people who understood each other's minds intuitively. But it was the moments between the medical emergencies that made Maria's breath catch. The way James brought her coffee without being asked. The The way he instinctively moved closer when she was reading emotional family stories. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, with something that resembled wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. "Maria," James said softly, "I need to ask you something personal." "What?" "When this is over, when the 48 hours ends, what happens to us?" The question hung in the air between them, like a bridge Maria wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. "I don't know," she admitted. "I go back to cleaning offices at night and try to pay rent. You go back to watching children die because their parents can't afford treatment. We become people who shared 2 extraordinary days and then return to ordinary lives." James moved closer, his voice gentle but insistent. "It doesn't have to be ordinary. What we're doing here, identifying families in crisis, coordinating medical interventions, proving that systematic charity can work. This could be permanent. This could be a foundation, an organization, a way of institutionalizing what you're doing with this credit card." Maria felt her heart hammering as she realized James wasn't just talking about their professional collaboration. "James, I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I'm falling in love with your compassion, your intelligence, your absolute refusal to use unlimited wealth for selfish purposes. I'm falling in love with the way you see possibilities where I see problems, the way you act when action is needed, the way you make me believe that good people can change the world." Before Maria could respond, her phone buzzed with another call from Alexander Kane. The 3rd time he had contacted her since the experiment began. "I have to answer it," James said. "But remember what I just said." Maria pressed the accept button with hands that were shaking slightly. "Mr. Kane, Ms. Santos, we need to meet. Now." Alexander's voice carried an urgency that made Maria immediately alert. This wasn't the clinical curiosity of someone monitoring an experiment. This was something more personal. "Is there a problem with the credit card?" "There's a problem with everything you're doing with the credit card. I've been reviewing the transactions, and I need to understand what's happening." Maria looked at James, who was listening with growing concern. "What specifically do you need to understand?" "In 16 hours, you spent $1.2 million. Not one penny of it on yourself or your daughter. You've paid medical bills for families you've never met. You've funded surgeries for children you don't know. You've created college funds for kids whose parents are fighting cancer." Alexander's voice was strained in a way that suggested he was struggling to process information that didn't fit his worldview. "Yesterday, you bought $3,000 worth of groceries and gave them to other families at the food bank. This morning, you paid 6 months of rent for a family facing eviction because their son's leukemia treatment made it impossible for them to work. An hour ago, you funded an experimental gene therapy treatment for a child whose insurance company refused to cover it." Maria could hear confusion in Alexander's tone. Not anger, but genuine bewilderment. "All of this is exactly what I told you I was going to do, Mr. Kane. I'm using your credit card to help people who need help. But you haven't bought anything for yourself. Nothing. Your daughter is wearing clothes from thrift stores while you're funding $100,000 medical procedures for strangers. They're not strangers. They're families facing the same crisis I faced when my daughter was sick. The same crisis that destroyed our financial stability and nearly cost Emma her life." There was a long pause before Alexander spoke again. "Ms. Santos, I need to meet with you in person. There are things about this experiment that you need to understand." "What things?" "Things I should have told you from the beginning. Can you come to my office? Bring Dr. Rivera if you want. I know you've been working with him." Maria felt a chill. Alexander had been monitoring more than just her transactions. He had been tracking her movements, her meetings, her relationships. "How do you know about Dr. Rivera?" "I know about everything, Ms. Santos. That's the point of the experiment." After Maria hung up, James reached for her hand. "This feels like more than just monitoring credit card usage," he said. "This feels like surveillance. I'm starting to wonder if Alexander Kane's experiment is more complicated than he initially described." "What do you mean?" Maria looked around their makeshift command center. The files of families they had helped, the list of children whose lives they had saved, the evidence of systematic charity that could be replicated and expanded. What if this wasn't just about testing my character? What if it was about something else entirely? Alexander Kane's office occupied the entire top floor of a downtown San Francisco skyscraper, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a view of the bay and the kind of minimalist design that suggested wealth beyond imagination. But it was Alexander himself who surprised Maria when she and James arrived for their meeting. The man who had approached her at the food bank had been coldly professional, clinically detached, emotionally remote. The man who greeted them in his office looked like someone who hadn't slept in 2 days and was struggling with thoughts that challenged everything he believed about himself. "Dr. Rivera, Ms. Santos, thank you for coming." Alexander gestured toward a conference table where he had spread out printed transaction records. Every purchase Maria had made with his credit card, organized chronologically and annotated with notes in his handwriting. "I need to show you what you've accomplished in 16 hours, Alexander said, his voice carrying something that might have been awe. "And I need to explain why it's affecting me in ways I didn't expect." Maria and James sat down, studying the transaction records that told the story of their medical intervention campaign. Sarah Williamson's lung transplant surgery, funded. Tyler Henderson's experimental leukemia treatment, funded. The Martinez family's cancer medication costs for the next year, funded. Priya Patel's genetic therapy, funded. Alexander was reading from the list with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a language he had never learned. "You've saved 11 children's lives in 16 hours. You've prevented 17 families from losing their homes to medical debt. You've funded experimental treatments that insurance companies refuse to cover." He paused, looking directly at Maria. "Ms. Santos, in my experience, when people are given unlimited financial resources, they use those resources to enhance their own lives. To buy things they've always wanted, to experience luxury they've never afforded, to indulge in pleasures they've been denied. That's not what unlimited resources mean to me, Mr. Kane. I'm beginning to understand that. But what I don't understand is why." James leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Kane, may I ask what you hope to learn from this experiment?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the transaction records that had apparently shattered his expectations. "I wanted to prove that people are fundamentally selfish, that given unlimited financial power, they reveal their true nature, which is greedy, short-sighted, and self-serving. And what have you learned instead?" Alexander looked up at Maria with an expression she couldn't interpret. "I've learned that my fundamental assumptions about human nature might be wrong. I've learned that some people become more generous, not more selfish, when they have power to help others. I've learned that poverty doesn't create moral weakness. It creates moral strength that wealthy people like me never develop." He stood up and walked to the windows overlooking the city. "Ms. Santos, I've spent 20 years building a fortune based on the assumption that people are essentially greedy and that business success comes from understanding and exploiting that greed. But watching what you've done with my credit card, watching you choose to save other people's children instead of helping your own daughter, it's forcing me to question everything I believe about money, charity, and human nature." Maria exchanged glances with James, sensing that Alexander Kane was building toward a revelation that would change everything about their situation. "Mr. Kane, what are you trying to tell us?" Alexander turned back from the window, and Maria saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability, confusion, and something that looked like the beginning of genuine emotion. "I'm trying to tell you that this experiment has become something I never intended. You're not just challenging my assumptions about poor people, you're challenging my assumptions about myself." He sat back down at the conference table, his composure finally cracking. "Ms. Santos, I have $8.2 billion. I could fund every medical charity in the country without affecting my standard of living. I could save thousands of children's lives without noticing the financial impact. But until I watch you do exactly that with my money, it never occurred to me that wealth could be used as a tool for systematic charity rather than personal accumulation." James was studying Alexander with the careful attention of someone trained to recognize emotional breakthroughs in crisis situations. "Mr. Kane, what are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that this experiment shouldn't end in 32 hours. I'm proposing that what Ms. Santos is doing, systematic identification and funding of medical emergencies, should become permanent. I'm proposing that my wealth should be used the way she's using it, rather than the way I've been using it." Alexander looked directly at Maria. "I'm proposing that you teach me how to be wealthy the way you understand wealth. And I'm proposing that we build an organization that can do permanently what you've been doing temporarily." Maria felt the world shifting around her as she realized Alexander Kane wasn't just offering to extend her access to unlimited resources. He was offering to transform his entire approach to money, charity, and human relationships. "Mr. Kane," she said carefully, "are you asking me to help you become a different kind of billionaire? I'm asking you to help me become the kind of person who deserves to have $8.2 billion, Alexander replied quietly. "Because watching you for the past 16 hours has made me realize that I've spent 20 years being rich without ever learning how to be wealthy." James reached for Maria's hand under the table, and she felt the warmth of his fingers as an anchor in a moment that was redefining everything she thought she knew about the next 32 hours. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Alexander leaned forward, and Maria saw something in his expression she had never expected to see from a billionaire: hope mixed with desperation. "I'm proposing that we establish a permanent medical charity foundation with unlimited resources. I'm proposing that you run it, that Dr. Rivera serves as medical director, and that we systematically save every child who could be saved with financial intervention." He paused, his voice dropping to something approaching humility. "I'm proposing that you transform my fortune into the kind of wealth that actually matters. And I'm proposing that I spend the rest of my life learning how to use money the way you've been using it for the past 16 hours. Maria looked at James, then at Alexander, then at the transaction records that told the story of 11 children who were alive because she had chosen to help others instead of herself. "Mr. Kane," she said quietly, "I think that's the most beautiful proposal I've ever heard." But even as hope built inside her chest, Maria realized that Alexander's offer was almost too good to be true. And in her experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. The question was, what was Alexander Kane not telling them about his true motivations for this experiment? And what would happen when they discovered his hidden agenda? The truth that shattered everything came at hour 24, when Maria noticed a familiar logo on one of the documents scattered across Alexander Kane's conference table. Meridian Health Insurance. The same company that had denied coverage for Emma's experimental treatments. The same company that had forced Maria to choose between her daughter's life and financial ruin. The same company whose systematic denial of claims had destroyed their family's stability and sent them spiraling into poverty. Maria picked up the document with trembling hands, recognizing the corporate letterhead that had appeared on dozens of rejection notices during Emma's treatment. "Mr. Kane," she said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous calm that made James immediately alert. "What is this Meridian Health Insurance document doing on your desk?" Alexander looked up from the transaction records he had been reviewing, and Maria saw something flash across his face: recognition, guilt, and the terrible understanding of someone whose carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "Maria, answer the question. What does Meridian Health Insurance have to do with your experiment?" The silence that followed was heavy with implications that neither James nor Maria fully understood yet, but both could sense approaching like a storm. Alexander Kane stood up slowly, moving to the window with the careful movements of someone buying time to construct an explanation for something that couldn't be explained. "Meridian Health Insurance is one of my companies," he said finally. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She felt James's hand reach for hers as the full implications began to dawn on both of them. "One of your companies," Maria repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I own controlling interest in Meridian Health, along with 12 other insurance companies, for pharmaceutical companies, and a network of medical billing services that serve most of the major hospitals in California." Maria felt the room spinning around her as she realized what Alexander was telling her. "You own the insurance company that denied coverage for my daughter's treatments." "Yes. You own the company that forced me to choose between Emma's life and our financial survival." "Yes." Maria was on her feet now, the credit card falling from her purse as she struggled to process the magnitude of Alexander Kane's revelation. "You own the company that destroyed our lives, took our home, ended my career, and drove us to food banks and transitional housing." "Yes." The single word hung in the air like a confession. James was looking between Maria and Alexander with growing horror as he understood what they were dealing with. "Mr. Kane," James said carefully, "are you telling us that you deliberately chose Maria for this experiment because you knew she was a victim of your company's policies?" Alexander turned from the window, and Maria saw tears in his eyes, the first genuine emotion she had seen from him since their meeting at the food bank. "I'm telling you that I've been tracking Maria Santos for 3 years," he said, his voice breaking. Ever since I learned that Meridian's denial of coverage for experimental leukemia treatments had forced a pediatric nurse to declare bankruptcy and lose her home. Maria felt her legs give out. She sank back in her chair, the full scope of Alexander's deception washing over her like a tide. You knew who I was when you approached me at the food bank. I knew exactly who you were. I knew about Emma's leukemia, about the medical bills that destroyed your finances, about your nursing career that ended when you couldn't maintain consistent work schedules. I knew about every detail of how Meridian's policies had systematically destroyed your family. James was staring at Alexander with an expression that mixed disbelief with growing anger. You've been stalking her for 3 years. I've been researching the human cost of my company's profit maximization strategies, Alexander corrected, though the distinction offered no comfort. Maria's case was one of hundreds I studied. Families destroyed by medical debt because insurance companies prioritize shareholder returns over patient care. Maria found her voice, though it came out raw with emotion she was struggling to control. So, this experiment, this wasn't about testing poor people's character. This was about your guilt. This was about understanding whether the damage I've caused can be repaired, Alexander said quietly. Whether someone like you, someone whose life I helped destroy, could forgive someone like me if I try to make amends. The conference room fell silent except for the sound of Maria's breathing, which had become sharp and irregular as she processed the full scope of Alexander's manipulation. You gave me unlimited credit for 48 hours not to test my character, but to assuage your conscience. I gave you unlimited credit because I needed to see if there was any way to undo the harm I've caused. And because I needed to understand how someone who had been so systematically betrayed by wealth and power could still choose to help others when given the opportunity. Maria stood up again, pacing to the window where she could see the San Francisco skyline, the city where she had once been a respected nurse, where she had owned a home, where she had believed the world was fundamentally fair. How many families, Alexander? How many families like mine have been destroyed by your company's policies? Based on our internal studies, Meridian's denial practices have resulted in bankruptcy for approximately 12,000 families over the past decade. Medical debt-related foreclosures affect an additional 8,000 families annually. Treatment discontinuation due to cost concerns affects roughly 3,000 children per year. The numbers were delivered with clinical precision, but Maria could hear the weight of guilt in Alexander's voice. And you've known these statistics for how long? I've had access to this data for 5 years. But I didn't understand what it meant until I started researching individual cases, until I learned about families like yours. James had been quietly listening to this exchange, but his expression was growing darker as he processed the implications. Mr. Kane, as a pediatric oncologist, I've watched children die because insurance companies denied coverage for treatments that could have saved them. Are you telling me that you've been personally profiting from policies that kill children? Alexander flinched as if James had struck him. Yes. And this experiment, this 48-hour test, was your way of trying to feel better about that. This experiment was my way of trying to understand if there was any possibility of redemption for someone who has built a fortune on other people's suffering. Maria turned back from the window, and Alexander saw something in her eyes that made him step backward. Redemption, she repeated, her voice carrying a fury that had been building for 3 years of poverty, struggle, and humiliation. You think you can achieve redemption by watching me spend your money on other families while my daughter wears clothes from thrift stores? Maria, you think you can buy forgiveness by giving me 48 hours of financial power while keeping me in poverty for the rest of my life? That's not what You think you can undo the damage you've caused to thousands of families by making one symbolic gesture toward the woman whose life you helped destroy? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but Maria wasn't finished. You want to know about redemption, Alexander Kane? Redemption isn't an experiment. Redemption isn't a performance. Redemption is systematic change that ensures what happened to my family never happens to anyone else's family. She moved closer to him, her voice dropping to something approaching whisper that somehow carried more power than shouting. You want to know if someone like me can forgive someone like you? Here's her answer. I can forgive you when every family facing medical bankruptcy receives the same unlimited credit card I've been carrying for 24 hours. I can forgive you when no child dies because their parents can't afford treatment. I can forgive you when your wealth serves life instead of destroying it. Alexander was crying now, not the composed, calculated emotion Maria had seen from wealthy people performing charity, but raw, broken tears of someone finally confronting the true cost of their choices. Maria, I'm offering to change everything. The foundation I proposed, unlimited resources for medical charity, that's permanent systematic change. That's exactly what you're asking for. Is it? Or is it another performance designed to make you feel better about continuing to profit from human suffering? James stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. Maria, I think Mr. Kane is trying to offer genuine reform. The question is whether we trust his motivations enough to work with him. Maria looked between James and Alexander, the man she was falling in love with, and the man who had destroyed her life and was now claiming he wanted to repair it. Alexander, she said finally, I need you to understand something about forgiveness. It's not something you can buy, even with unlimited credit cards. It's something you earn through actions that prove you've changed who you are, not just what you're willing to spend. She paused, feeling the weight of the decision that would define not just her own future, but the futures of thousands of families facing the same crises she had survived. If you want redemption, if you want forgiveness, if you want to transform your fortune into something that serves life instead of destroying it, then prove it. Not with a 48-hour experiment, but with a lifetime commitment to systematic change. Alexander wiped his eyes, looking at Maria with something approaching hope. What would that look like? It would look like dismantling the insurance company practices that destroy families. It would look like funding medical treatments for every child who needs them. It would look like transforming Meridian Health from a profit extraction machine into a force for healing. She held up the credit card that had started this entire confrontation. And it would look like giving this kind of power to people like me permanently. People who understand what poverty feels like, who know the real cost of medical debt, who will use wealth to serve others rather than themselves. James reached for Maria's hand, and she felt his support like an anchor in a conversation that was redefining everything she thought she knew about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Alexander, she said softly, I'll work with you. I'll help you transform your fortune into something that saves lives instead of destroying them. I'll teach you what I've learned about using wealth to serve others. Alexander looked at her with gratitude that seemed to overwhelm him. But Maria continued, there's one condition. One non-negotiable requirement for any partnership between us. What? Maria looked directly into Alexander Kane's eyes, seeing the broken billionaire who had finally confronted the human cost of his empire. You give me control, not advisory input, not consulting authority, full control over how your medical charity fortune is used. You trust me to make decisions about which families receive help, which treatments get funded, which children's lives get saved. The request hung between them like a bridge that Alexander could either cross or burn. You're asking me to give you power over billions of dollars. I'm asking you to trust the judgment of someone who has lived through the consequences of your previous decisions. I'm asking you to trust that someone who has been poor understands how to use wealth better than someone who has only been rich. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering the magnitude of what Maria was proposing. Then slowly he nodded. Yes, I'll give you control. I'll trust your judgment about how to use my fortune to help families. Like yours. Maria felt something shift inside her chest. Not just hope for the thousands of families they could help, but something deeper. The recognition that forgiveness was possible, even for someone who had caused unimaginable harm, if they were willing to surrender their power to serve others. Then let's save some lives, she said simply. James squeezed her hand, and Maria realized that the past 24 hours had given her more than unlimited financial resources. They had given her unlimited possibility for love, partnership, and a chance to transform suffering into healing on a scale she had never imagined. Alexander Kane had thought he was conducting an experiment in human nature. Instead, he had discovered what redemption actually looked like. And Maria Santos had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal was not revenge, but the grace to offer someone a chance to become worthy of forgiveness. The darkest hour came at 3 a.m. on the second day, when Emma Santos woke up burning with fever in the single room they shared at the transitional housing facility. Maria had been at the hospital with James, coordinating the final 12 hours of their medical intervention campaign, when Mrs. Chun from down the hall called with words that stopped Maria's heart. "Emma is sick. Very sick. I think you need to come home now." Maria arrived to find her daughter delirious with fever, her small body shaking with chills that reminded Maria of the darkest moments during Emma's cancer treatment 3 years ago. The same symptoms, the same terrifying fragility that had nearly cost Emma her life before. "Mama," Emma whispered, her voice weak and confused. "I don't feel good." James had followed Maria home and was examining Emma with the gentle expertise that had made Maria trust him completely over the past 48 hours. "Her fever is 104, he said quietly. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately. This could be a recurrence of her leukemia, or it could be an infection her immune system can't fight because of the damage from her previous treatments." Maria felt her world collapsing around her. For 48 hours, she had been saving other people's children while her own daughter's health hung in the balance. She had used Alexander Kane's unlimited credit card to fund medical miracles for strangers, while Emma wore thrift store clothes and slept in a single room with no health insurance. "I'm a terrible mother," Maria said, tears streaming down her face as James helped lift Emma into his car. "I've been so focused on helping other families that I ignored my own daughter's needs." "You're the best mother I've ever met," James replied firmly. "And Emma is going to be okay. We're going to make sure of it." But as they rushed through the empty streets toward UCSF Children's Hospital, Maria realized that Alexander Kane's experiment was about to end in 6 hours, and with it, her access to unlimited medical resources for Emma's emergency. The cruel irony was devastating. She had spent 48 hours proving that unlimited wealth should be used to save children's lives, and now her own child needed saving just as the resources were about to disappear. At the hospital, Maria sat in a waiting room chair while James coordinated Emma's emergency care with the pediatric oncology team. Alexander Kane had arrived after James called him, and now stood awkwardly near the vending machines, clearly wanting to help, but unsure how to offer assistance to a woman whose life his company had already destroyed once. "The test will take several hours," James said when he returned from speaking with the medical team. "But Dr. Richardson thinks this might be pneumonia caused by Emma's compromised immune system, not a cancer recurrence. Pneumonia can still be life-threatening for someone with Emma's medical history," Alexander said quietly. "What kind of treatment is she likely to need?" "Extended hospitalization. For antibiotics. Possibly respiratory support if her condition worsens. Even with insurance, we're looking at tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills." Maria laughed bitterly. "Insurance. Emma doesn't have insurance, Mr. Kane. When I lost my job, we lost our coverage. And your company, Meridian Health, has already rejected our applications twice because of her pre-existing condition." Alexander went completely still, the full impact of his company's policies finally becoming personal in a way that statistics couldn't convey. "My policies are preventing Emma from receiving medical care." "Your policies have been preventing Emma from receiving medical care for 3 years, Maria corrected. "The only reason she's being treated right now is because Dr. Rivera has admitting privileges and is willing to guarantee payment." Alexander looked at James, then at Maria, then at the hospital around them, a place where children's lives were saved or lost based on their family's ability to pay for treatment. "Maria," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something. The 48-hour experiment, it doesn't have to end at noon today." "What do you mean?" "I mean the credit card doesn't deactivate automatically. I can extend it indefinitely. I can make it permanent." Maria stared at him, hardly daring to hope. "You're saying I could have unlimited medical resources for Emma?" "I'm saying you could have unlimited medical resources for Emma, for every family we've helped over the past 2 days, and for every family we'll encounter in the future." Alexander sat down beside Maria, his billionaire composure completely gone. "Maria, watching what you've done with my money, watching you choose to save other people's children even while your own daughter was getting sick, it's taught me something I never learned in 50 years of being wealthy." "What?" "That money isn't wealth. Wealth is what you've been showing me. Wealth is using resources to create more life, more health, more hope than existed before." Alexander pulled out his phone and made a call that Maria could hear clearly. "This is Alexander Kane. I want you to liquidate my personal investment portfolio immediately. All of it. $8.2 billion. I want it transferred to a new charitable foundation by close of business today. Maria felt her breath catch as she realized Alexander wasn't just making promises. He was taking action that would permanently transform his fortune. Sir, came a voice on the other end of the line. Are you certain you want to liquidate your entire portfolio? I'm certain that I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to use money the way Maria Santos has been teaching me. When Alexander hung up, he looked at Maria with tears in his eyes. The Santos Medical Foundation will be operational by tomorrow morning. You'll have permanent, unlimited funding to save children's lives, Emma's treatment, and the treatment of every child you identify as needing help. But it was what happened next that fulfilled the promise of the story's title. Dr. Richardson emerged from Emma's room with a smile that immediately eased Maria's terror. Good news. It's definitely pneumonia, not a cancer recurrence. With proper treatment, Emma should make a full recovery within a week. Maria collapsed with relief, tears streaming down her face as 3 years of accumulated fear finally found release. James wrapped his arms around her, and Maria felt something she hadn't experienced since before Emma's diagnosis. The feeling of being completely safe, completely supported, completely loved. She's going to be okay, James whispered against her hair. Emma's going to be okay, and so are you. But it was Alexander Kane who surprised everyone with what he did next. He knelt beside Maria's chair, tears flowing freely down his face, and spoke words that no one in that waiting room expected to hear from a billionaire. Maria, I need to apologize. Not just for the experiment, not just for my company's policies, but for spending 50 years of my life believing that wealth was about accumulation instead of service. Alexander's voice broke with emotion that seemed to come from decades of suppressed humanity. You've been poor for 3 years because of my choices. You've struggled to feed your daughter, to keep a roof over her head, to pay for medical care, because I prioritize profit over human life. And when I gave you unlimited wealth, you used it to save other people's children instead of securing your own daughter's future. He paused, wiping his eyes with hands that shook with the magnitude of his emotional breakthrough. You've taught me what it means to be truly wealthy. You've shown me that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. You've proven that someone who has lost everything can still choose to serve others, while someone who has everything can lose their humanity entirely. Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a document that made Maria's heart stop. This is the deed to my Marin County estate. 37 acres, a Maine. House with 6 bedrooms and a guest cottage that would be perfect for Emma to grow up in. He placed the deed in Maria's hands. It's yours, along with a salary of $2 million annually to run the Santos Medical Foundation and unlimited medical coverage for Emma for the rest of her life. Maria stared at the deed, hardly able to process what Alexander was offering. You're giving me your home? I'm giving you what should have been yours all along: security, stability, and the resources to continue saving children's lives. James was looking at Alexander with something approaching admiration. Mr. Kane, this is extraordinary. No, Dr. Rivera, what's extraordinary is watching someone choose love over revenge, generosity over bitterness, forgiveness over hatred. Maria had every right to destroy me when she learned I was responsible for her family's suffering. Instead, she chose to help me become someone worthy of redemption. Alexander stood up, his transformation from cold billionaire to broken human being complete. Maria, you asked me to prove that I've changed. Here's my proof. I'm giving you control of my entire fortune, my home, and my life's work. I'm trusting you to use my wealth better than I ever did. Maria looked at James, then at Alexander, then at the deed in her hands that represented not just a house, but a future she had never dared to imagine. Alexander, she said softly, 48 hours ago, you wanted to test my character. What you discovered instead is your own. What I discovered is that wealth without wisdom is worthless. That power without compassion is meaningless. That money without love is just numbers on a screen. 6 months later, Maria stood in the garden of what was now the Santos family home, watching Emma play with children from the medical foundation. Kids whose lives have been saved by unlimited access to treatment, whose families have been spared the financial devastation that once destroyed Maria's life. James had moved into the guest cottage, and their relationship had grown from partnership to love to something deeper. The recognition that they were building not just a foundation, but a family committed to serving others. Alexander lived in a small apartment in the city and worked 18 hours a day, learning how to give away wealth as effectively as he had once accumulated it. He visited the foundation regularly, not as its owner, but as its most dedicated volunteer. Mama, Emma called from where she was building a fort with 3 other children. Can we make cookies for the new families coming tomorrow? Of course, sweetheart, Maria replied. As the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Maria felt Alexander's presence beside her on the garden bench. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly. Forgiving me? Working with me? Trusting me with your future? Maria looked at the children playing in the garden. Children who were alive because unlimited resources had been used to serve life rather than accumulate wealth. No, she said simply. I regret that it took 48 hours for you to learn what some people understand instinctively. But I don't regret helping you become the person you were always capable of being. Alexander nodded, tears glistening in his eyes, as they did most evenings when he witnessed the life that had grown from his decision to surrender his wealth to someone who understood its true purpose. Thank you, he said, for teaching me that the richest people aren't those who have the most, but those who give the most away. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Maria held James's hand and watched their daughter laugh with joy that no amount of money could buy, but that unlimited love had made possible. The experiment that began with cynicism had ended with transformation. The billionaire who thought he was testing others had discovered himself, and the woman who had lost everything had gained more than she ever imagined. Not just wealth, but love, family, and the power to heal the world one child at a time.